Chapter 27. The Organization for Man's Existence, created by the very saintly Ashiata Shimash. Beelzebub continued to relate further as follows. My further researches and investigations also cleared up for me that after the very saintly Ashiata Shimash had pondered on a mountain Verziniyama and had formulated in his mind a definite plan for his further most saintly activities, he did not again return to the city of Babylon, but went straight to the capital city, Djoolfapal, of the country then called Kurlandtech, which was situated in the middle of the continent Asia. There, he first of all established relations with the brethren of the then existing brotherhood, Tchaftantouri, a name signifying to be or not to be at all, which had its quarter not far from that city. This said brotherhood was founded 5 of their years before the arrival there of the very saintly Ashiata Shimash, on the initiative of 2 genuine terrestrial initiates, who had become initiates according to the principles existing, as it was then said there, before the Ashantian epoch. The name of one of these 2 terrestrial 3-brained beings of that time, who had become genuine initiates there, was Poundolero, and of the other, Sensimiriniko. I must remark, by the way, that both of these 2 terrestrial genuine initiates of that time had already by then quoted in their common presences their higher being parts to the gradation called completion, and hence they had time during their further existence to perfect these higher parts of theirs to the required gradation of sacred objective reason. And now their perfected higher being parts have even become worthy to have and already now have the place of their further existence on the holy planet Purgatory. According to my latest investigations, when in all the separate spiritualized parts of the common presences of these 2 3-brained beings of that period, Poundolero and Sensimiriniko, there arose and was continuously sensed the suspicion, which later became a conviction, that owing to some obviously non-lawful causes, something very undesirable for them personally had been acquired and had begun to function in their general organization, and that at the same time it was possible for this something very undesirable to be removed from themselves by means of their own data within themselves. They then sought several other beings like themselves who were striving for this same aim, in order together to try to achieve the removal from themselves of this said something very undesirable. And when they soon found beings responding to this aim amongst what are called the monks of places called monasteries, of which there were already many of that period in the environs of the town Djoolfapal, they, together with these monks chosen by them, founded the said brotherhood. And so, after arriving in the town Djoolfapal, the very saintly Ashiata Shimash established corresponding relations with these brethren of the mentioned brotherhood, who were working upon that abnormally proceeding functioning of their psyche which they themselves had constated. And he began enlightening their reason by means of objective true information, and guiding their being impulses in such a way that they could sense these truths without the participation either of the abnormally crystallized factors already within their presences, or of the factors which might newly arise from the results of the external perceptions they obtained from the abnormally established form of ordinary being existence. While enlightening the brethren of the said brotherhood in the mentioned way, and discussing his suppositions and intentions with them, the very saintly Ashiata Shimash occupied himself at the same time in drawing up what are called to be rules, or, as it is also said there, statutes for this brotherhood, which he, in association with these brethren, he initiated of the former brotherhood, Tchaftantouri, founded in the town Djoolfapal, and which later was called the brotherhood Heechtvori, which signified, only he will be called and will become the Son of God who acquires in himself conscience. Later, when, with the participation of these brethren of the former brotherhood Tchaftantouri, everything had been worked out and organized, the very saintly Ashiata Shimash sent these same brethren to various places and commissioned them under his general guidance to spread the information that in the subconsciousness of people there are crystallized and are always present the data manifested from above for engendering in them the divine impulse of genuine conscience, and that only he who acquires the ableness that the actions of these data participate in the functioning of that consciousness of theirs in which they pass their everyday existence, has, in the objective sense, the honest right to be called and really to be a genuine son of our common Father Creator of all that exists. These brethren then preached this objective truth at first chiefly among the monks of the mentioned monasteries, many of which, as I have already said, existed in the environs of the town itself. The result of these preachings of theirs was that they first of all selected 35 serious and well prepared, what are called novices, of this first brotherhood, Heechtvori, which they founded in the city Djoolfapal. Thereafter, the very saintly Ashiata Shimash, while continuing to enlighten the minds of the former brethren of the brotherhood Tchaftantouri, then began with the help of these brethren to enlighten the reason of those 35 novices also. So it continued during the whole of one of their years, and only after this did some of them, from among the brethren of the former brotherhood Tchaftantouri, and from among the 35 said novices, gradually prove worthy to become what are called all the rights possessing brethren of this first brotherhood Heechtvori, according to the statutes drawn up by the very saintly Ashiata Shimash. Any brother could become an all the rights possessing brother of the brotherhood Heechtvori only when, in addition to the other also foreseen definite objective attainments, he could bring himself, in the sense of ableness of conscious direction of the functioning of his own psyche, to be able to know how to convince to perfection 100 other beings, and to prove to them that the impulse of being objective conscience exists in man, and secondly, how it must be manifested in order that a man may respond to the real sense and aim of his existence, and moreover, so as to convince them that each of these others, in their turn, should acquire in themselves what is called the required intensity of ableness, to be able to convince and persuade not less than 100 others also. It was those who become worthy to become such an all-the-rights possessing brother of the brotherhood Heechtvori who were first called by the name of priest. For your complete elucidation concerning the very saintly activities of Ashiata Shimash, you must also know that afterwards, when all the results of the very saintly labors of the very saintly Ashiata Shimash were destroyed, both this word priest there and also the word initiate, about which I have already told you, were used and still continue to be used by your favorites down to the present time in two quite different senses. In one sense, this word priest was since then and now still is commonly used, but only in certain places and for unimportant separate groups of those professionals existing there whom everybody now calls their confessors or clergymen. And in the other sense, those beings were called and are still called by this word priest, who by their pious existence and by the merits of their acts performed for the good of those around them, stand out so much from the rank and file of the ordinary three-brained beings there, that whenever these ordinary beings there have occasion to remember them, there arises and proceeds in their presences the process called gratitude. Already during that same period, while the very saintly Ashiata Shimash was enlightening the reason of their brethren of the former brotherhood Tchaftantouri, as well as the newly collected 35 novices, there began to spread, among ordinary beings of the city Djoolfapal and its environs, the true idea that in the common presences of man beings, all the data exist for the manifestation of the divine impulse conscience, but that this divine impulse does not take part in their general consciousness, and that it takes no part because, although their manifestations bring them certain what are called quite late repaying satisfactions and considerable material advantage, nevertheless, they thereby gradually atrophy the data put into their presences by nature, for evoking in other beings around them without distinction of brain system the objective impulse of divine love. This true information began to spread, thanks chiefly to the superlative wise provision of the very saintly Ashiata Shimash, which obliged everyone striving to become an all the rights possessing brother of the brotherhood Heechtvori to attain. As I have already told you, in addition to all kinds of definite self-merits, the ableness to know how to convince all the three separate spiritualized and associating parts of a further 103 brain beings there concerning the divine impulse conscience. When the organization of the first brotherhood Heechtvori in the city Djoolfapal had been more or less regulated and was so established that the further work could already be continued independently, by means only of the directions issuing from the reason then present in the brotherhood. Then the very saintly Ashiata Shimash himself selected from among those who had become all the rights possessing brothers of the brotherhood, those who had already sensed the said divine impulse, consciously by their reason and unconsciously by the feelings in their subconsciousness, and who had full confidence that by certain self-efforts this divine being impulse might become and forever remain an inseparable part of their ordinary consciousness. And those who had sensed and become aware of this divine conscience, and who were called first-degree initiates, he set apart. And he began to enlighten their reason separately concerning these objective truths, which before that time were still quite unknown to the three-brained beings. It was just these outstanding first-degree initiated beings who were then called great initiates. Here it must be remarked that those principles of being of the initiated beings there, which were later on called their Ashiatas renewals, were then renewed by the very saintly Ashiata Shumash. Well then, it was to those same great initiates who were first set apart that the very saintly Ashiata Shumash, now already the most very saintly, then among other things, also elucidated in detail what this being impulse, objective conscience is, and how factors arise for its manifestation in the presences of the three-brained beings. And concerning this he once said as follows: the factors for the being impulse conscience arise in the presences of the three-brained beings from the localizations of the particles of the emanations of the sorrow of our omni-loving and long-suffering endless Creator. That is why the source of the manifestation of genuine conscience in three-centered beings is sometimes called the representative of the Creator. And this sorrow is formed in our all-maintaining common Father, from the struggle constantly proceeding in the universe between joy and sorrow. And he then also further said, in all three-brained beings of the whole of our universe without exception, among whom are also we men, owing to the data crystallized in our common presences for engendering in us the divine impulse of conscience, the whole of us and the whole of our essence are and must be already in our foundation only suffering. And they must be suffering because the completed actualizing of the manifestation of such a being impulse in us can proceed only from the constant struggle of two quite opposite what are called complexes of the functioning of those two sources which are of quite opposite origin, namely, between the processes of the functioning of our planetary body itself and the parallel functionings arising progressively from the quoting and perfecting of our higher being bodies within this planetary body of ours, which functionings in their totality actualize every kind of reasons in the three-centered beings. In consequence of this, every three-centered being of our great universe, and also we men existing on the earth, must, owing to the presence in us also of the factors for engendering the divine impulse of objective conscience, always inevitably struggle with the arising and the proceeding within our common presences of two quite opposite functionings, giving results always sensed by us either as desires or as non-desires. And so, only he who consciously assists the process of this inner struggle and consciously assists the non-desires to predominate over the desires behaves just in accordance with the essence of our common Father Creator Himself, whereas he who with his consciousness assists the contrary only increases his sorrow. Owing to all I have just said, my boy, at that period scarcely 3 years had passed when, on the one hand, all the ordinary beings of the town Djoolfapal and its environs, and also of many other countries of the continent Asia, not only already knew that this divine being impulse of genuine conscience was in them, and that it could take part in the functioning of their ordinary waking consciousness, and that in all the brotherhoods of the great prophet Ashiata Shimash, all the initiates and priests elucidated and indicated how and what had to be done in order that such a divine impulse should take part in the functioning of the mentioned ordinary waking consciousness. But furthermore, nearly everybody even began to strive and to exert himself to become priests of the brotherhood Heechtvori, of which many brotherhoods were already founded during that period and functioned almost independently in many other countries of the continent Asia. And these almost independent brotherhoods arose there in the following order. When the common work of the brotherhood founded in the town Djoolfapal was finally established, the very saintly Ashiata Shimash began sending the said great initiates with corresponding directions to other countries and towns of the continent Asia, in order to organize similar brotherhoods there also, while he himself remained in the town Djoolfapal, from where he guided the activities of these helpers of his. However it might have been, my boy, it then so turned out that almost all of your favorites, those strange three-brained beings, also wished and began to strive with all their spiritualized being parts to have in their ordinary waking consciousness the divine, genuine, objective conscience. And in consequence, most of the beings of Asia at that time began to work upon themselves under the guidance of initiates and priests of the brotherhood Heechtvori, in order to transfer into their ordinary consciousness the results of the data present in their subconsciousness for engendering the impulse of genuine divine conscience, and in order to have the possibility, by this means, on the one hand of completely removing from themselves, perhaps forever, the maleficent consequences of the properties of the organ kunda buffer, both those personally acquired and those passed to them by heredity, and, on the other hand, of consciously taking part in diminishing the sorrow of our common endless Father. Owing to all this, the question of conscience already began to predominate at that period during the ordinary process of being existence, both in the waking consciousness state and in the passive instinctive state among your favorites, particularly among those who existed on the continent Asia. Even those three-brained beings of that time in whose presences the taste of this divine impulse had not yet been transubstantiated, but who had in their strange peculiar consciousness, proper to them alone, only empty information concerning this being impulse, which could be present in them as well, also exerted themselves to manifest in everything in accordance with this information. The total result, however, of everything I have mentioned was that within 10 terrestrial years there had disappeared of their own accord those two chief forms of ordinary being existence abnormally established there, from which there chiefly flow and still continue to flow most of the maleficent causes, the totality of which engenders all kinds of trifling factors which prevent the establishment of conditions there for at least a normal outer being existence for these unfortunate favourites of yours. And namely, firstly, their division into numerous communities with various forms of organization for external and even internal existence, or as they themselves express it, state organizations, ceased to exist. And secondly, in these said numerous communities there also disappeared equally, of their own accord, those various what are called castes or classes, which had long before been established there. And in my opinion, as you also will surely understand eventually, it was precisely this second of the two mentioned chief abnormally established forms of ordinary being existence, namely, the assigning of each other to different classes or castes, that had specially become there the basis for the gradual crystallization in the common presences of these unfortunate favourite of yours, of that particular psychic property which, in the whole of the universe, is inherent exclusively only in the presences of those three-brained beings. This exclusively particular property was formed in them soon after the second Transylpanian perturbation there, and, gradually undergoing development and becoming strengthened in them, was passed from generation to generation by heredity, until it has now already passed to the contemporary beings as a certain lawful and inseparable part of their general psyche. And this particular property of their psyche is called by themselves egoism. Some time later, in its appropriate place, during my further tales concerning the three-brained beings existing on the planet Earth, I shall also explain to you in detail how, thanks to those conditions of external being existence which were established there, your favourites first began assigning each other to various castes, and how, thanks to subsequent similar abnormalities, this same maleficent form of mutual relationship then established there has continued even until now. But meanwhile, concerning this exceptionally particular property of their general psyche, namely egoism, it is necessary for you to know that the cause of the possibility of the arising in their common presences of this particular property was that, owing always to the same abnormal conditions established from the very beginning after the said second Transylpanian perturbation there, their general psyche had become dual. This became fully evident to me when, during the period of my last sojourn on the surface of this planet of yours, I became deeply interested in the mentioned legomenism concerning the deliberations of the very saintly Ashiata Shimash entitled The Terror of the Situation. I began in the course of my further detailed researches and investigations relating to his subsequent very saintly activities and their results, to investigate the causes in which way and why the crystallization of the mentioned factors obtained from the particles of the emanation of the sorrow of our common Father Creator, for the actualizing of the divine being impulse of objective conscience proceeding in their presences, that is to say, just in their said subconsciousness, and thus avoided that final degeneration to which are subject all the data placed in them for engendering in their presences the being impulses, faith, love, and hope. And I was convinced that this strange anomaly there fully justifies one of the numerous wise sentences of our highly esteemed, irreplaceable, and honourable Mullah Nasser Adun, which states, "Every real happiness for man can arise exclusively only from some unhappiness also real, which he has already experienced." The mentioned duality of their general psyche proceeded because, on the one hand, various what are called individual initiatives began to issue from that localization arising in their presences, which is always predominant during their waking existence, and which localization is nothing else but only the result of the accidental perceptions of impressions coming from without and engendered by their abnormal environment, which perceptions in totality are called by them their consciousness. And on the other hand, similar individual initiatives also began to issue in them, as it is proper to them, from that normal localization existing in the presences of every kind of being, and which they call their subconsciousness. And because the mentioned individual initiatives issue from such different localizations during their waking existence, each of them, during the process of his daily existence, is, as it were, divided into two independent personalities. Here, it must be remarked that just this said duality was also the cause that there was gradually lost from their presences that impulse necessary to three-brained beings, which is called sincerity. Later, the practice of deliberately destroying the just mentioned being impulse called sincerity even took root among them. And now, from the day of their arising, or, as they say, from the day of their birth, the three-brained beings there are accustomed by their producers, or, as they say, parents, to an entirely contrary impulse, namely, deceit. To teach and to suggest to their children how to be insincere with others and deceitful in everything has become so ingrained in the beings of the planet Earth of the present time that it has even become their conception of their duty towards their children. And this kind of conduct towards their children they call by the famous word, education. They educate their children never to be able and never to dare to do as the conscience present in them instinctively directs, but only that which is prescribed in the menu of bon ton, usually drawn up there just by various candidates for Hasnamuses. And of course, when these children grow up and become responsible beings, they already automatically produce their manifestations and their acts, just as during their formation they were taught, just as they were suggested to, and just as they were wound up. In a word, just as they were educated. Thanks to all this, the conscience which might be in the consciousness of the beings of that planet is, from their earliest infancy, gradually driven back within, so that by the time they are grown up, the said conscience is already found only in what they call their subconsciousness. In consequence, the functioning of the mentioned data for engendering in their presences this said divine impulse conscience gradually ceased long ago to participate in that consciousness of theirs by means of which their waking existence flows. That is why, my boy, the crystallization in their common presences of the divine manifestation issuing from above for the data of the arising of this sacred being impulse in them proceeds only in their subconsciousness, which has ceased to participate in the process of their ordinary daily existence. And that is why these data have escaped that degeneration to which all the other sacred being impulses were subject, and which they also ought to have in their presences, namely, the impulses faith, love, and hope. Furthermore, if, for some reason or other, the actions of the divine data, crystallized in their presences for the said being impulse, should now begin to manifest themselves in them from their subconsciousness, and should strive to participate in the functioning of their abnormally formed ordinary consciousness, then no sooner are they aware of it than they at once take measures to avoid it, because it has already become impossible in the conditions already existing there for anyone to exist with the functioning in their presences of this divine impulse of genuine objective conscience. From the time when the said egoism had become completely inoculated in the presences of your favorites, this particular being property became, in its turn, the fundamental contributory factor in the gradual crystallization in their general psyche of the data for the arising of still several other quite exclusively particular being impulses now existing there under the names of cunning, envy, hate, hypocrisy, contempt, haughtiness, servility, slyness, ambition, double-facedness, and so on and so forth. These exclusively particular properties of their psyche, which I have just named, utterly unbecoming to three-brained beings, were already fully crystallized in the presences of most of your favorites, and were the inevitable attributes of the psyche of every one of them even before the period of the very saintly Ashiatashimash. But when they began to be fixed and to flow automatically in the process of their being existence, the new form of existence intentionally implanted in them by Ashiatashimash himself, then these strange properties, previously present in their psyche, entirely disappeared from the presences of most of the three-brained beings there. Later, however, when they themselves destroyed all the results of the very saintly labors of this essence-loving Ashiatashimash, these same psychic properties, maleficent for themselves, gradually again arose anew in all of them, and for them, the contemporary three-brained beings there, they are already the foundation of the whole of their essence. Well then, my boy, when the data arose in the common presences of your favorites for engendering this unique particular being impulse, egoism, and when gradually evolving and giving rise to factors ensuing from it for other also particular, but now secondary strange being impulses, this said unique property egoism usurped the place of the unique or autocratic ruler in their general organization. Then, not only every manifestation, but even what is called the desire for the arising of such a divine being impulse become a hindrance to the actions of this all-autocratic ruler. And in consequence of this, when eventually your favorites had already, by force of necessity, both consciously and unconsciously, always and in everything, prevented it partaking in the functioning of that consciousness of theirs through the control of which it had become proper for them to actualize their waking existence. The actions of those divine data were gradually, as it were, removed from the functioning of their ordinary consciousness and participated only in the functioning of their said subconsciousness. And it was only after my detailed researches and investigations had made all the foregoing clear to me that I understood why there arose and why there still exists that division of themselves there into various classes or castes, which is particularly maleficent for them. My later detailed researches and investigations very definitely and clearly show me that in that consciousness of theirs, which they call their subconsciousness, even in the beings of the present time, the set data for the acquisition in their presences of this fundamental divine impulse conscience does indeed still continue to be crystallized, and hence to be present during the whole of their existence. And that these data of this divine being impulse are still crystallized, and their manifestations still continue to participate in the process of their being existence, was, apart from the said investigations, further confirmed by the fact that I frequently had a good deal of difficulty on account of it during the periods of my observation of them from the planet Mars. The point is that through my Tasguano from the planet Mars, I could freely observe without any difficulty whatsoever the existence proceeding on the surfaces of the other planets of that solar system. But making my observations of the process of the existence proceeding on the surface of your planet was, owing to the special coloration of its atmosphere, a real misery. And this special coloration occurred, as I later ascertained, because there appeared from time to time, in the presence of this atmosphere, large quantities of those crystallizations which were frequently radiated from the presences of these favorites of yours, owing to that particular inner impulse which they themselves call remorse of conscience. And this proceeded because in those of them who chanced to receive and experience some kind of what is called shock to organic shame, the associations proceeding from their previous impressions almost always become changed, calm, and sometimes, even for a time, entirely ceased in them, which associations, as I have already told you, consist mostly of various kinds of what is called rubbish. In consequence, there is then automatically obtained, in these three-brained beings there, such a combination of functioning in their common presences as temporarily frees the data present in their subconsciousness for the manifestation of the divine impulse conscience and for its participation in the functioning of their ordinary consciousness, with the result that this said remorse of conscience proceeds in them. And as this remorse of conscience gives rise to the mentioned particular crystallizations which issue from them with their other radiation, the result is that the totality of all these radiations occasionally gives the atmosphere of this planet of yours that particular coloration which hinders the being organ of sight from penetrating freely through it. Here it is necessary to say that these favourite of yours, particularly the contemporary ones, become ideally expert in not allowing this inner impulse of theirs, called remorse of conscience, to linger long in their common presences. No sooner do they begin to sense the beginning, or even only, so to say, the prick of the arising of the functioning in them of such a being impulse, than they immediately, as it is said, squash it, whereupon this impulse, not yet quite formed in them, at once calms down. For this squashing of the beginning of any remorse of conscience in themselves, they have even invented some very efficient special means, which now exist there under the names of alcoholism, cocaineism, morphineism, nicotineism, onanism, monkeyism, Athenianism, and others with names also ending in ism. I repeat, my boy, at a suitable occasion I shall explain to you in detail also about those results issuing from the abnormally established conditions of ordinary existence there, which became factors for the arising and the permanent existence there of these for their maleficent assignment of themselves to various cases. I shall without fail explain this to you, because the information elucidating this abnormality there may serve as very good data for your further logical comparisons for the purpose of better understanding the strangeness of the psyche of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy. Meanwhile, transubstantiate in yourself the following. When the mentioned particular psyche property of egoism had been completely formed in the common presences of these favourites of yours, and later, there had also been formed in them various other secondary impulses already mentioned by me, which ensued and now still continue to ensue from it. And furthermore, in consequence of the total absence of the participation of the impulse of sacred conscience in their waking consciousness, then these three-brained beings arising and existing on the planet Earth, both before the period of the very saintly activities of Asia Tashimash, and also since, have always striven and continue to strive to arrange their welfare during the process of their ordinary existence, exclusively for them themselves. And as in general, on none of the planets of our great universe does there or can there exist enough of everything required for everybody's equal external welfare, irrespective of what are called objective merits. The result there is that the prosperity of one is always built on the adversity of many. It is just this exclusive regard for their own personal welfare that has gradually crystallized in them the already quite particular, unprecedented, and peculiar properties of their psyche which I cited, as for instance, cunning, contempt, hate, civility, lying, flattery, and so on, which in their turn, on the one hand, are factors for an outer manifestation unbecoming to three-brained beings, and on the other hand, are the cause of the gradual destruction of all those inner possibilities of theirs placed in them by great nature, of becoming particles of the whole of the reasonable whole. Well then, my boy, At the time when the results of the very saintly labors of the essence-loving Ashiata Shimash had already begun to blend with the processes of what is called their inner and outer being existence. And when, thanks to this, data for the divine impulse conscience surviving in their subconsciousness gradually began to share in the functioning of their waking consciousness, then the being existence, both personal and reciprocal, began to proceed on this planet also, almost as it does on the other planets of our great universe on which three-brained beings exist. These favorites of yours also then began to have relations toward each other only as towards the manifestations varying in degree of a unique common creator, and to pay respect to each other only according to the merits personally attained by means of being park dog duty, that is, by means of personal conscious labors and intentional sufferings. That is why, during that period, there ceased to exist there the said two chief maleficent forms of their ordinary existence, namely, their separate independent communities, and the division of themselves in these communities into various castes or classes. At that time also, there upon your planet, all the three-brained beings began to consider themselves, and those like themselves, merely as beings bearing in themselves particles of the emanation of the sorrow of our common Father Creator. And all this then so happened because, when the actions of the data of the divine being impulse began to participate in the functioning of their ordinary waking consciousness, and the three-brained beings began manifesting themselves towards each other, solely in accordance with conscience. The consequence was that masters ceased to deprive their slaves of freedom, and various power-possessing beings of their own accord surrendered their unmerited rights, having become aware by conscience and sensing that they possessed and occupied these rights and positions not for the common welfare, but only for the satisfaction of their various personal weaknesses, such, for instance, as vanity, self-love, self-calming, and so on. Of course, at that period also, there continued to be all kinds of chiefs, directors, and advisor specialists, who became such chiefly from difference of age and from what is called essence power, just as there are everywhere on all planets of the universe on which there breathe three-brained beings of varying degrees of self-perfecting, and they then become such, neither by hereditary right nor by election, as was the case before this blissful Ashiatian epoch, and as again afterwards became, and even till now continues to be the case. All these chiefs, directors, and advisors then became such in accordance with the objective merits they personally acquired, and which could be really sensed by all the beings around them. And it proceeded in the following way. All the beings of this planet then began to work in order to have in their consciousness this divine function of genuine conscience, and for this purpose, as everywhere in the universe, they transubstantiated in themselves what are called the being obligonian strivings, which consist of the following five, namely, the first striving, to have in their ordinary being existence everything satisfying and really necessary for their planetary body. The second striving, to have a constant an unflagging instinctive need for self-perfection in the sense of being. The third, the conscious striving to know ever more and more concerning the laws of world creation and world maintenance. The fourth, the striving from the beginning of their existence to pay for their arisings and their individuality as quickly as possible, in order afterwards to be free to lighten as much as possible the sorrow of our common Father. And the fifth, the striving always to assist the most rapid perfecting of other beings, both those similar to oneself and those of other forms, up to the degree of the sacred Motai, that is, up to the degree of self-individuality. At this period, when every terrestrial three-centered being existed and worked consciously upon himself in accordance with these five strivings, many of them, thanks to this, quickly arrived at results of objective attainments perceptible to others. Of course, these objective attainments then, as it is said, attracted the attention of all around them, who thereupon made those who had attained stand out from their midst and pay them every kind of respect. They also strove with joy to merit the attention of these outstanding beings, and to have for themselves their counsel and advice how they themselves could attain the same perfecting. And these outstanding beings of that period began in their turn to make the most attained among themselves stand out, and this outstanding being thereby automatically became, without either hereditary or other right, the chief of them all. And recognizing him as chief, his directings were spread correspondingly, and this recognition included not only the separate neighboring parts of the surface of your planet, but also even the neighboring continents and islands. At that period, the counsel and guidance, and in general every word of these chiefs, became law for all the three-brained beings there, and were fulfilled by them with devotion and joy, not as it had proceeded there before the results obtained by the very saintly labours of Ashiata Shimash, nor as it again proceeded and still continues to proceed, since they themselves destroy the fruits of his very saintly labours. That is to say, these strange three-brained beings, your favourites, now carry out the various commands and orders of their chiefs and, as they are called kings, only from fear of what are called bayonets and lousy cells, of which there are a great many at the disposition of these chiefs and kings. The results of the very saintly labours of Ashiata Shimash were then also very definitely reflected in respect of that terrible peculiarity of the manifestation of the psyche of your favourites, namely, in their irresistible urge for the periodic destruction of each other's existence. The process of reciprocal destruction established there and ensuing from that terrible particularity of their psyche entirely ceased on the continent Asia, and only proceeded occasionally on those large and small parts of the surface of that planet of yours, which were far from the continent Asia. And this continued there only because, owing to their distance, the influence of the initiates and priests could not reach and be transubstantiated in the presence of the beings breeding on these parts of the surface of your planet. But the most astonishing and significant result of the very saintly labors of Ajaata Shimash was that at that period, not only did the duration of the existence of these unfortunates become a little more normal, that is to say, it began to increase, but also what they call the death rate also diminished. And at the same time, the number of their results manifested for the prolongation of their generation, that is, as they say, their birth rate, diminished to at least a fifth. Thereby there was even practically demonstrated one of the cosmic laws, namely, what is called the law of the equilibration of vibrations. That is, of vibrations arising from the evolutions and involutions of the cosmic substances required for the most great omni-cosmic trogo alter ego craft. The said decline in both their death rate and their birth rate proceeded because, as they approximated to an existence normal for the three-center beings, they also began to radiate from themselves vibrations responding more closely to the requirements of great nature, thanks to which nature needed less of those vibrations which are in general obtained from the destruction of the existence of beings. You will also understand well about this cosmic law, equilibration of vibrations, when, at the proper time, I shall explain to you in detail, as I have already many times promised you, concerning all the general fundamental cosmic laws. It was just in this way, my boy, and in such a sequence that there in that period, thanks to the conscious labors of the very saintly Ajaata Shimash, the said welfare unprecedented for your favorites was gradually created. But to the infinite sorrow of all more or less consciously thinking individuals of all gradations of reason, shortly after the departure from this planet of the very saintly Ajaata Shimash, these unfortunates themselves, after the manner that had become in general proper to them before, in respect of every good attainment of their ancestors, totally destroyed it all. And thus it was they destroyed, and thus it was they swept away from the surface of their planet all that welfare, that even the rumor has failed to reach contemporary beings there, that once upon a time such bliss existed. In certain inscriptions which have survived from ancient times and have reached the contemporary beings of that planet, there is, however, some information that there once existed on their planet what is called a special kind of state organization, and that at the head of every such state were beings of the highest attainments. And on the basis of this information, the contemporary beings have invented just a mere name for this state organization. They call it a priest organization, and that is all. But what constituted this priest organization, and how and why it was? Is it not all the same to the contemporary beings of the planet Earth what ancient savages did?